it go, but it's harder, yeah. I hate to see it go, but it's oh so hard. I hate to see it go, but it's harder, yeah. I hate to see it go, but it's oh so hard. I hate to see it go, but it's harder, yeah. To say that I can't forgive you and I won't forget. It's the point of no return. You said what you said. The fire burned and the water turned red, red,
How's it going, everybody? Welcome back for week 11, Mon Hills Audio Hour. And this week, our topic is time-based effects. There's a reason that I elected to save this topic for the end rather than include it up front when we were talking about specific types of processors, like our episode about EQ or about compression. The reason for that is EQ and compression are more of your nuts and bolts mixing functions, which will get you 80-90% there in terms of what you're trying to achieve with your sound. But a lot of times, if you forego time-based effects, you can end up with a dry, flat, uninteresting sounding mix. But they are absolutely secondary to your manipulation of frequency and your manipulation of dynamics. That being said, they can make a strong mix, like, you know, a mix where the EQ and compression decisions used were applied correctly and well. They can take a strong mix and make it even better. They will not save a bad mix. But I think one of the toughest things about time-based effects, especially for new and learning mix engineers, is they can seem sort of abstract in how you're supposed to use them. They have their own kind of vocabulary of terms, which we're going to talk about, which isn't anything crazy. It's just there's not usually an explanation as to what all of those mean. You kind of just have to intuit what they mean a lot of the time. But I'm going to try to shed some light on that. To me, the primary function and goal of using time-based effects, which for the purposes of this episode, time-based effects is a catch-all term used to describe any processor which manipulates time, like the timing of an input signal, and uses that manipulation to create an output signal, which includes reverbs, delays, choruses, and flanges. There's also another type of processor called a phaser, which is similar to a flange. Me personally, I've never used one in a mix. That tends to me to be more of a like an input effect used on an instrument, like you might use a phaser on a guitar or on a keyboard as it's being recorded, like to color the tone of the sound before it's recorded. But I've never used a phaser in post, but that's not really the point. For today, we're going to focus on the four primary types of time-based effect: reverb, delay, chorus, and flange. But before we get into breaking down the uses of each one, I'd like to talk a little bit about the overall goal with time-based effects, which for me is controlling, I'm going to use the word focus, which is more of a visual term, but to me it applies here in that I find the application and use of time-based effects on source material has the overall effect and allows you to exert control over the focus of a part. It allows you to kind of set the front to back spacing of a part. If you're thinking about your stereo image, you know how parts, as you hear them in the stereo field, sometimes it can seem like they're lined up in front of you. Like there's parts on the left, there's parts on the right, there's parts in the middle, but they're all like parallel with each other. Well, using time-based effects, you can kind of simulate the effect of moving parts closer to you or further away from the listener, which kind of allows you to define in one sense, it allows you to define the positioning of a sound, and it also allows you to define the priority level of that sound. Like, if there's a part that you want to stay out front, you're probably not going to bury it in a bunch of time-based effects. And if there's a part that you want to have in there, but you don't want it competing with your important parts, you might wash that out in some effects and take it out of focus a little bit. So it's still there, but it's perhaps not as clear, not as distinct or crisp in its own right. It's just another way of creating separation apart from your equalizers. Before we get into the demonstrations of each of these modules, I want to, I think it'll be helpful to give a list of definitions about the terms used for the controls of these types of processors. We're talking about 4 different types of processors in this episode, but most of them, like most of their controls, exist in all 4 of them, and the terms mean the same thing regardless of whether you're talking about a chorus or a delay or a flange or whatever. So I'm going to start with a vocab first. Let me flip over to Pro Tools for the sake of that, though. 1 second. Okay. How do I want to do this? I'll just pull up this. So this is a chorus. I'm just going to use it for demonstration of the controls. So first control we're going to talk about, first term, is pre-delay right here. Okay. What pre-delay is the amount of time in milliseconds between whatever the input source is. It's the amount of time between the input source happening and that source being fed through the process, which sounds abstract to say, but when we get into demonstrations, it'll probably be a little clearer. But basically, like if I have a singer singing and I want to send that vocal through a reverb or something, I might choose, rather than as soon as that singer sings a word, rather than having it immediately sent through the reverb, I might choose to give it some pre-delay, meaning the singer you'll hear the dry word first, or a part of the dry word first, before that word is sent through the through the reverb. That's what pre-delay allows you to achieve. like I said, when we demonstrate, that'll be a little bit clearer. Next control is feedback. And feedback allows you to control in percentages the amount of the output of the process, which becomes the input of the process. So again, kind of abstract, but to continue using a vocal as an example, say I send a vocal through a delay. All right, so I've got the input, which is the dry vocal. Goes through the delay, it's delayed, and then that delayed signal is output. Feedback control means you can take a percentage of that output level and send it back through the input, meaning you're delaying the delays. This gives you the effect of where you hear delays trailing off and you hear multiple repeats. That's because of feedback. So like the first delayed signal that's output goes back to the input in a certain percentage, but obviously it's quieter than the original. And then, when that output signal comes out, it's a little bit quieter and it's fed back to the input, and it just continues until it eventually will decay, which brings us to another control, which only exists in reverbs. There's a couple of those, but decay, controlled here, usually in seconds, is the amount of time it takes for the output signal to fall below the audible range. So like, you have, if like pretend you're standing in a church with a really high ceiling, and you clap your hands and you hear it ringing, and you can count the amount of time that you hear it ringing in the ceiling of you clapping your hands. So if you can count to 3, then that room has a 3-second decay. That's how that's exemplified. Next term I want to define is here, the LFO. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. This is an electronic process which generates a wave with the intention of that generated wave interacting with the input wave in such a way to create whatever effect you're trying to achieve, whether that's a pitch bend, whether that's flanging, chorusing. But this usually LFO controls give you a selection of the type of wave. So like in this case, I could choose between a triangle wave and a sine wave, which just kind of gives you different, slightly different tonal characteristics. You also sometimes are given control over the phase. Phase in this case is applied because if you're taking an input signal and delaying it slightly, like you are with choruses or delays, sometimes that can cause, if they're really close delay times, that can cause phase anomalies, partial cancellation, because the input is playing back so close to itself. So the phase control allows you to try to compensate for that by inverting the phase of the processed signal so that it doesn't interact as much with the original. You also have a mix control, which is fairly self-explanatory. This sets the blend between the affected signal and the unaffected signal. We're going to get into routing considerations with these, which will inform how you use your mix control later. I'm just going to say right now, though, typically I will leave my mix controls at 100% and use aux channels for my time-based effects. That's not always the case, but more often than not, that's the case. We'll get into why that is. Next, we have the modulation section here. Modulation as a term just means a change of pitch, or in music, it means a change of key center in a song. But in mixing, it's a little bit more generic and just means changing of pitch content. Modulation is achieved with two controls in tandem. First of which is rate, which is a measure in hertz of the amount of times in a time interval, in this case second, the amount of times per second that a change of pitch occurs. Don't mix up hertz with rate with hertz with audible frequency spectrum. They are technically the same measurement, but if you turn, the control knob up, that's not raising the pitch of this effect. What it is doing is it's raising the number of times that the pitch is changed. So the way I have this set right now at 1 hertz, and again, this is a chorus, for example, but signal is going to come into this after the pre-delay. It's going to be affected by the LFO to bend the pitch. That pitch is going to bend 1 time every second. So if this was higher, like if I raise it, now that pitch bend is going to be twice as fast. If it happens once per second before, now it's happening twice per second. And I can raise that or decrease it. There's also this particular module doesn't have it, but there are some effects that we'll see as we get into this, where you have what's called a sync option. It'll just be a button that says sync, SYNC, which sets the rate for you based on the tempo that you have your session at. It'll read whatever your tempo map, whatever BPM your tempo map is set to, and it will park the rate at a relative value according to the subdivision of that. So let me pull up this one here. So like in this case, pre-delay, we'll talk about depth here in a second, feedback, and rate. Rate, we have a sync control here, and we have all these musical notes which correspond to the subdivision. So right now it's set to whole note, meaning every measure of music, this effect will go through one full period of its process. If I were to set that to a half note, it would be every 2 beats, there would be a full process, and on down. So that's pretty handy sometimes if you were, if your song was recorded to a click track and has a steady reference of time, this can be a nice way to quickly set your rate controls. There's another way to do it manually, which I'll talk about, but this just kind of saves you from doing some math. The other modulation control is depth. So if rate controls the amount of times a pitch change occurs every second, the depth refers to by how much that pitch is changed. how exaggerated that effect is, and that's that can sometimes be read out in milliseconds, like it is here. Sometimes that's just as a percentage, as it is here. In either case, it's how wide, like how exaggerated the effect of the pitch change is. And like I said, this will all get a little easier as I start demonstrating. The only other term I want to define up front is the other reverb only term, and it is diffusion. Diffusion is an acoustic term referring to a surface's propensity to diffuse frequencies, meaning it doesn't absorb them, it doesn't reflect them, but it diffuses them. It breaks them apart and casts them off to the sides rather than like a reflective surface, a sound wave would hit it and it would come right back in the same direction. And an absorptive surface, a sound wave would hit it and go nowhere. It would stop and not be reflected. With a diffuse surface, a sound wave hits it, and rather than being reflected back in the direction of incidence, it's reflected to the sides, and therefore does not interact with the listener more than once. In layman's terms, in the context of reverb generation, what that means is your diffusion control is basically a mix knob for your reflections, which is difficult to explain without just exemplifying it. Yeah, I'll just show that in the example. But whenever you see diffusion controls on a reverb plugin, just think, okay, how much of the actual walls do I want to hear, and how much of just the tail of the reverb do I want to hear? That's kind of the easiest way I can think to describe it. But yeah, we are now going to get into some examples. The first of which is going to be reverb, because that is probably the most common time-based effect, kind of the most natural one. Reverb is used to, as I'm sure you know by now, set the acoustic space, the perceived acoustic space that a performance is happening within. Applying more reverb to a part has the effect of making it sound further away from the listener, and reducing the amount of reverb on a part has the effect of the source being perceived as being closer to the listener. I'm going to use my snare drum as an example for this first reverb. So we can hear that sounds nice and live. If I take that away, so you hear how it sounds like you're like right next to that drum. But then if I put this back on, now it sounds like that drum's in a room, and you're in the room, but you're not necessarily next to it. What's happening with that is... All right, so first thing I want to talk about is how I have this routed. I have created a bus channel, an auxiliary input for this reverb. I've inserted the reverb on the channel. I have the input of the channel being fed by a stereo bus 17 and 18. And I have the snare sending at unity up the center over that bus. So my snare, after processing, becomes the input of this channel. The reason for that is rather than using the mix control and inserting this effect on the snare channel itself, now I just have the entire reverb of that snare on this fader, and I can use the fader as my mix control. You might think that those are interchangeable. Some might say that they are. For me, I don't see them as equivalent for a couple reasons. Mix control, like if I were to insert this on a channel, like on an audio channel, the mix control, regardless of what setting it's at, is going to cut your output level by some amount, which isn't desirable in terms of your channel processing. So it would be difficult to recover the amount of level that you would lose by running through a time-based effect on an insert on an audio channel. So that's one. The other thing, especially with reverb, is usually you don't have just one thing going through a reverb, because the reverb is supposed to be representative of an actual physical space. So it would be unnatural if every instrument had a different reverb. So rather than inserting the same reverb in varying mix degrees on every audio channel that you want to be reverberated, you can just create a bus channel and send in parallel any sources that you want through that reverb over that bus. And then again, you have a fader control of the entire reverb, all elements going through it, which to me is just easier to deal with. And it keeps it cleaner too. Then you have a distinct unaffected and affected source. The other upside of doing routing your time-based effects in parallel is you can also separately EQ them, because, you know, effectively what you're creating is another instrument or another audio part to the song. Yes, it's being created based off of the snare or whatever else is being fed through it, but it's fundamentally changing the tone, the pitch, the timing of that part, and it's bringing it back in parallel with the original part. So that's effectively created, at the very least, another perspective on that part, if not another acoustical property entirely. So that should be, you have to control where you want that to sit in your frequency range, just as you would any other discrete audio part. So in this case, on this reverb, there's a couple EQ controls in the effect itself. I have a low-pass filter and what's called a high-frequency cut, which is really just a subtractive high shelf. So I've set my upper boundary here. I'm rolling off gently everything above 3.6 kilohertz. And then I come over here on my EQ that's inserted after this effect. And I'm high passing, setting my lower boundary at 360 hertz. And then I'm notching out here in the mid-range just to keep that from competing with any fundamentals or early harmonics that are happening in that range, which is, I mean, everything exists in that range. So just keeps this out of the way. So the reverb is only going to fill in spaces where it should be filling in, and it's going to stay out of the way of frequencies where you want more of the dry signal. Also worth talking about, there are various types of reverbs. And you have these options here. Nonlinear is a little bit of that could be a whole discussion in itself. It has to deal with the way, artificially sampling an actual physical space, like taking measurements and sampling it, and then using those samples to derive values for your use of it. Not gonna lie, I've not found a practical application for it for myself. I don't see it as being any better than any of the other traditional reverb settings. Room and ambient are effectively the same thing, and in this particular reverb, it gives you a room 1, a room 2, and an ambient, just a couple different options of space. Pretty self-explanatory. You're in a room with 4 walls and a ceiling and a floor, and you can manipulate, using your decay and your diffusion, the behavior of that room. Oh, and you also have some general size, parameters here, which are just small, medium, and large, which will kind of affect your decay, but you can change your decay within that as well. You have a hall reverb, which is kind of like room reverb, except it's assumed that it's bigger and longer than it is wide, so that gives it a specific kind of characteristic. And I'll cycle through these. Church, which is kind of just like another really, really big room, which might have some curved surfaces like a vaulted ceiling or pillars or something like that. So just a different characteristic than like a hall or a normal room. Then you also have a plate. There's also another type called spring, which is similar to plate. These are artificial reverbs, which are created in the case of a plate by suspending an actual metal plate with springs and sending the signal electrically across that plate, and then using contact microphones to pick up the way that plate is vibrating relative to the signal that's being sent through it. Sounds like it wouldn't sound very good, but honestly, that's probably one of my favorite types of reverb. It just has to me, it's easier to manipulate. Spring reverb works the same way, except instead of being a plate, it's a spring, it's a metal coil. Let me go ahead and just cycle through these so you guys can kind of hear the differences. I'll go ahead and exaggerate this effect here. So that's a room reverb. There's a plate reverb. And you hear how it's naturally a little bit brighter. I mean, it does change the EQ settings, so that's going to be part of that too. But you can just hear how that has a little bit, a more metallic sort of sound. Here's a church. And here is a good example of the exaggerated effect of pre-delay. The reason why if you do use pre-delay at all, which for me I sometimes do, but it's never more than 20 milliseconds. The reason you got to be careful with pre-delay is because it can have the effect of a discrete delay if it gets long. In this case, 40 milliseconds in pre-delay terms is pretty long. You'll hear it as a discrete echo rather than a reverb. See how you're hearing that attack twice? You're hearing the dry attack and then the delayed attack going through the reverb. Perhaps that might be a desirable effect. For me, that's not ever something that I'm trying to achieve. And then a hall. So you can already hear right away that's kind of like, that's a pretty standard sounding reverb. And it is. Hall reverb is the most common type, followed by room and plate. Now for me, I was using this, I set it relative to my snare, but I was using it for most of my instruments. So I'm going to go ahead and recreate how I had it. It was a medium room where I had my decay at 1.8 seconds. I had no pre-delay. I was low passing down to 15 kilohertz and cutting from 3.6 kilohertz. Again, notice my mix knob is all the way up. It is not down here. It's all the way wet, 100% wet, because I have my dry signal separate. Oh, I also need to show diffusion. So right now that's 87% diffused. If I turn that all the way up, see how that's mostly tail. But then if I take this out, you're hearing more of the actual reflection from the walls. It's a subtle change, but you can hear this start getting more spacious and like less slappy. I'm going to go ahead and reset my fader level for it. And then just to show you the effect that this has, I'm going to play the whole mix and then take it out. So you see when I turn that off, it's like everything just jumps into a flat line in front of you. But when I bring it in, like then there's kind of like more of a depth arrangement. I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. It also just sounds more natural. And notice you don't really hear discrete reverb from that, but you feel it. Like you feel it when it goes away. It just sounds like dry and more unnatural. Sounds like it was recorded separately. The way that I'm setting my fader balances with this and with all of them, if I'm using multiple sources, because again, I'm using, like, for that reverb, I've got snare, hi-hat, toms, overheads, and this room center, this mono room perspective going through that same reverb, as well as my guitar and my keyboard and my background vocals and my horns and my lead vocal a little bit. So that reverb creates the space that everybody lives in for this. But I'm setting it based on, usually I set that reverb, and I usually use that reverb in all of my mixes, or some, it's not set the same way, but I approach it with that same principle. Like I want to have one reverb that everything goes through. Other than my kick and my bass. I usually set that relative to the snare. So I always set my snare send at 0 and then set my reverb and set the blend level on the fader relative to the snare. And then everything else I control the blend using the send. So like a little bit less of the keyboard, a lot less of the guitar, you know, more, a lot more on that room mic. You know, a lot less on the lead vocal, and you know, you can realize like why that is. I'm setting my relative spacing front to back of these parts using that reverb. I also have a longer reverb that I've got just set pretty much for the vocals and solo elements, like really just lead vocal, background vocals, and horns.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door.
So here I'm using a hall rather than a room. EQ'd similarly. A little bit of a longer decay, about a second longer.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like
Kind of gives it the effect of being kind of dramatic. But again, it's a very subtle mix. Like
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door.
So you notice the way it's EQ'd, you don't really hear it except when she's not singing.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette.
Just at the ends of those phrases. And it just makes it feel a little bit more natural, helps it occupy a space unto itself, which is a thing that you want for lead parts, in addition to occupying the space with everything else. Just kind of gives it an extra dimensionality, makes it feel distinct because it's the only thing occupying that other acoustic space. With that, I think we can get into delay. I've got two delays happening, again, routed the same way, parallel on auxes in this project. In this case, this delay also gives you some modulation effects where it can change the pitch of the feedback. Not doing that. It does give you an onboard EQ section where you have a high pass and a low pass. I'm high passing up to 300 hertz because you don't want anything below that in your delays, and I'm low passing down to 2100 hertz, which is just a preference I have. Like, to me, that's how a delay should sound. Some people probably leave more top end than that. But yeah, on this particular delay, I'm using it as a slap, meaning there's no feedback, and it's a really short delay time. This has the effect of, well, here, I'll just show you. Again, this is pretty much only used on a vocal and my other lead parts.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when...
Here, I'll exaggerate the effect here.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So once you leave, don't come back no more.
So you can hear that it's, it's just doubling it effectively. It's not feeding back or anything. It's not getting spacious. It's just quick slap that I had mixed really low, just to kind of, to me, it gives it a little bit of an edge relative to everything else, just that you're hearing it twice so quickly in tandem. Like, your brain doesn't perceive it as being twice because I've got it mixed so low, but again, you feel it. You're going to find a lot of these changes aren't things that you're meant to hear so much as you're meant to feel. But here, I can use this just as an example of the delay controls. So
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun.
So if I take that low pass off, see how it starts to seem like it's closer to you.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run.
It gets more muffled the more I roll that down. and then the high pass.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run.
See if I take that off and it gets kind of muddy.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run.
And it
You're
kinda,
like,
like, doesn't exist if you take it way too high. So set that there. Now, if I want to increase my delay time,
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun.
so now there's 318 milliseconds between the singer singing something and that delay playing it back.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with a fully.
You see, that can get pretty disorienting if it's not set properly, which is why if your song was recorded to a click, you really want to make sure that you're using a delay interval that is a rhythmic subdivision of that tempo. So let me show you what I mean. So in the case of this song, our tempo is set at 110 beats per minute. So the way to manually, and this is like I was talking about earlier, sync control allows you to do this, like allows the computer to make this calculation for you. But if you don't have a sync control and you want to manually figure out what your delay time or your rate should be, all you have to do is take the amount of milliseconds in a minute, because it's beats per minute, convert that to milliseconds. So there's 1,000 milliseconds in every second. There's 60 seconds in every minute. So every minute is 60,000 milliseconds. So if you take 60,000 divided by your beats per minute, which in our case is 110, that gives you that resulting number will represent the duration in milliseconds of a quarter note relative to that tempo, which in the case of this song is 545 milliseconds. So let's test that. Go ahead and mute this.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run.
All right, so we should hear, if I type in 545, we should hear this as a quarter note delay.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door.
So you see how that, like, it just kind of grooves better with itself because it's rhythmically in time. Now, if I wanted to make that slower, like if I wanted it to be a half note, all I have to do is double it. So if I make this 1090, that'll be a half note.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. And my favorite.
I could even make it a whole note if I chose to, which is kind of crazy. But if we double this again, it'll be a whole note. If we go to 2180.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out.
Not necessarily the most useful thing, but it is a thing you can do. And likewise, if I'm at 545 quarter note and I want to go faster, I just divide that by 2. So if 545 is a quarter note, then 273-ish is our eighth note.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door.
And if I wanted to go to a 16th note, I'd just divide in half again. Down to 136.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun.
And if I wanted to go even faster, down to a 32nd note, I could just divide in half again and get 68.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run.
Which is what we originally had. Now, if I want to start playing with feedback, I'd typically set this a little bit longer, say at a quarter note to start with.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So once you leave, don't come.
So you see, like, it creates this swirling effect, this trailing, just kind of really spacious sort of effect, which can be cool in certain instances to just kind of have floating in the background. I do have a tempo delay set up for that I'll A-B for you here. So I'll set that back to how I had it for the slap. So if I open up my other effects here.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So once you leave, don't come back no more. I hate to see you go, but it's harder.
I've got an eighth note delay on 30% feedback. So 30% of each output becomes a new input, and it swirls kind of like this.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like
And here, I'll put this in context so you can kind of hear the overall effect.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So once you leave, don't come back no more. I hate to see you go, but it's harder yet to say that I can't.
So it almost creates kind of a sense of, I don't want to say disorientation, but you know, it becomes a little less distinct. You don't really know which direction it's coming from, but it's so low that in this case it just kind of has the effect of kind of constantly swirling underneath everything. Again, since that's only used on the lead vocal and a little bit on the background vocals and the horns, it's kind of just to keep that distinct from the instrumental. Another thing I'm doing is, and another upside of separating your time-based effects onto their own bus channels, is since if I want to bury that reverb backwards, like front to backwards a little bit more, I can send this delay back through my long reverb that the vocal's going through. So that just kind of makes it's almost like another feedback, except instead of repeating a delay, it's washed out into a reverb and moved further to the back. So that just makes it that much more subtle, that much less in focus. So those are your reverbs and your delays, which are the most common. I use those in pretty much every mix. Something I don't use in every mix, but does get used for certain things, is a chorus, which we're going to talk about here. For me, I typically use chorus to control the focus of panned instrumental elements, which most usually is guitars and sometimes keyboards. Usually on guitars, though, because guitars just kind of by nature, well, pianos too, guitars and keyboards both, I guess, can have a propensity to stick out of a mix and kind of try to occupy a lot of space and compete for your attention as a listener. And chances are good you probably don't want your listener paying very close attention to a rhythm guitar part or a comping piano part, or at least not paying attention to it compared to the amount of attention they're paying to the vocal. So what you can use a chorus for is kind of, like I said in the beginning, taking that out of focus. So we'll play the guitar here. And notice I've got these are my guitar microphones on the amplifier, coming to a bus, being processed. That bus is then going to another bus. The only reason for that, like that wouldn't be the case ordinarily, but I've used, this is a template I created for this album, and there are other songs in the album that have multiple guitars, like an electric and an acoustic, and then those would both come back to this bus and be EQ'd and compressed together. And then that bus is also feeding in parallel this other channel, which gives me a fader blend of the chorus effect. So if I take that away, so you see how that's a lot more distinct, a lot more in focus, a lot clearer, a lot more out front, which by itself sounds good. But if I play it with the track,
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun.
see how when I take that off, it's like poking out too much. It's like not staying in where you want it. It's like it's trying to steal the show from the vocal. But if I bring that back in,
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded.
and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, it's there. Like I'm hearing the part, but it's not in the way. I'm not hearing it first. I have to kind of like look for it in order to find it, which for this guitar part in this song, yeah, that's what you want. Let me show you a little bit about what is happening here. So mix is still all the way up because I've got it on a bus channel. I've got the phase inverted to get out of the way, like to not have too many anomalies. If I were to reduce this, so that also kind of changes the amount of the effect being applied in a way too, because that's happening concurrently with the low frequency oscillator. Listen subtly for how the tone changes when I flip to a triangle wave. Exaggerate this a bit. So you hear how the sine wave is kind of more smooth, whereas the triangle has a little bit more of an edge to it. In the case of this song, I liked the smoother sound better. 1.2 milliseconds of pre-delay, just a tiny amount. If I were to bring that up, you'd start hearing like it as a discrete delay. Even that, like this effect only gives you up to 24 milliseconds, so even that's not that exaggerated, but I just want it nice and tight here. If I were to up the feedback, so that's the same as on a delay, where just the output becomes the input in a certain percentage, and you hear. Remember that sound for when we talk about our next processor. But we had this here. And if I were to exaggerate the rate, so right now it's at 1 millisecond, 1 cycle per second. So that's 10 cycles per second. And it's obnoxious. But if I have 1/10 of a cycle per second, you don't really hear it. So for this, 1 millisecond was like right on the money. And if I were to exaggerate the depth of that, so that's the amount of bend that the pitch change undergoes. The rate is how many times the change happens, and the depth is how much of a change is happening. So if it's all the way up, it's obnoxious. If it's all the way down, you can't hear it. And then you mix that nice and subtly, so you've still got the distinctness of the dry sound, but it just is ever so slightly obscured relative to the other stuff. This is the only element in the mix that I'm using chorus on. Another reason for that is this song has two harmonic rhythmic elements, and both of them are panned. One is the Rhodes keyboard, and one is this guitar. And in this song, to me, the Rhodes is the more important element than the guitar. The Rhodes is doing more for the harmony than the guitar is, so I've left the Rhodes free of any time-based effects except for a little bit of that reverb, that first room reverb that everything's going through, which the guitar is in as well. But then I've obscured the guitar relative to the keyboard and relative to everything else pretty much, just a little bit, so that the listener gets a sense of what the priority is. Here, I'll play the two parts together. If I get rid of the chorus, you hear the sharpness of that guitar kind of dominates like the smoothness of the Rhodes. When I turn that back on, they can both kind of live and coexist harmoniously without getting in the way of each other, but still giving the piano that like perceived priority.
But I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded.
Like you, as the listener, I feel like you have to concentrate more to find the guitar than you would to find the keyboard. And that's what I wanted in this case, which is why I chose to apply that there. The one more thing we're going to talk about is flange. Again, I use flange even less than I use chorus, but sometimes I will use it. I am using it in this session a little bit. One effect that I'm achieving or trying to achieve with this lead vocal is, so this channel is the vocal, and then I have that being bussed to this mono bus because I want to keep it in mono for the processing. I'm sending parallel out of the lead vocal to this octave generator, which is also going through the mono bus, just to give it some body, like we talked about in our lead vocal episode. We also have a doubling that happens just in the first part of the choruses. Just for that, of a thickening effect, which I also have running through the same processing because it's the same part, just twice. But then, since everything is in mono, which is how I want it, but since it's the lead vocal and you want it to be present everywhere, I wanted some reference of it on the sides as well in the stereo field. So what I did is I took the same bus that was sending out of that lead vocal and sent it to this stereo bus, and basically just dumped a bunch of ridiculous effects on it, with the intention of creating this really obscure vocal up the sides, just a little bit, just enough to be there, but not enough to like get in the way of any of the panned information. It's just to kind of keep the vocal's head above water. Let me show you what I mean.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette. I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette left with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out.
All right, so what's happening on this? I've got doubler with a bunch of modulation on it. You know, here, let me just kind of strip off what's happening here. Actually, what I can do is I'll do this.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you.
So that's the vocal, doubled,
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run.
which you notice is kind of a chorus effect that I'm achieving with this, but it's also doing some stereo positioning as well. I'm flipping it out of phase because, like we said, we're going to be introducing some delays, and we don't want them to cancel anything in the original. Like the chorus gives you that effect on board, or that control on board, but this I'm kind of creating it in stages here, so I didn't have that, but I needed it. So that's all this is doing, is just inverting the phase. Going through this, which is kind of like a harmonizer effect.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite.
Again, you can see using a triangle LFO this time, so it's got a little bit more edge to it. This also has a rate control and an EQ section. So, you know, all time-based effects are gonna, if you know how to use one, you can figure out how to use all of them, which is kind of my point with this. This is a very specific kind of effect that I've very seldom used, but it ended up working for this application.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun.
Oh, you see sync too, auto syncing to our tempo here.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're
So notice the
like.
harmonization happens in time with the song, which is cool. It makes it, allows you to make it more present in level without getting in the way, without sounding distracting. But what we're really here to talk about is the flange.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette.
Remember how I said pay attention when I cranked the feedback all the way up on that chorus? That creates a flange effect, which is characterized by that like sweep effect. That's what a flange does, and to me, the use of that. So if a chorus is to obscure and take parts in and out of focus, a flange to me is to introduce motion. It's to kind of create the effect of air moving, which can be really cool. And in a subtle part like this, I think it just adds a little bit of life to this part. It makes it interesting. Again, not in a way that you hear it, like nobody's going to listen to this song and go, oh, wow, listen to the flange on that stereo vocal bus. That's really cool. No one's going to hear it, but your brain is going to perceive it, and it's just going to make the song sound distinct and different and exciting. Hopefully, that was my intention with using it. But to exaggerate this effect,
I wanted to leave, but I
so
had
just a little
nowhere
bit of
to
redelay.
run.
You
You're
can hear it a
like
little bit.
Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So
Oh, I've also got my mix control set at 72% wet, meaning I am passing a little bit of the previous effects through this without being affected by the flange. We have our sync, our rate sync set at a whole note, meaning that sweep is going to happen over the course of 4 beats.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're
So I can
like
make it twice as
Russian
fast.
roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So once you leave, don't come back no more. I hate to see you go, but it's harder yet to say that
We got our depth control,
I wanted to leave,
which
but I
controls
had.
the extremeness of the sweep.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So until
Then we have a feedback control too.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite.
And this particular module actually has a negative feedback control, which in the case of a flange just means that the sweep happens in the opposite direction.
I wanted
So,
to
like-
leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So once you leave, don't come back no more.
But to illustrate what I'm using this for, set this back how it was.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run.
You gotta really pay attention to the stereo image here. I'll show you soloed and then in context as well. But again, you're just listening for the presence of the vocal on the sides as opposed to up the center, and the motion of the vocal.
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere
that's
to
on.
run. You're like
take it away.
Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door.
See how it just kind of feels more alive? It almost sounds synthetic by itself, but if I bring it in with the track,
I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to run. You're like Russian roulette with the fully loaded gun. And my favorite side is when you walk out that door. So once you leave, don't come back no.
it's a subtle difference, but I really do think it makes it more exciting and more interesting as a listener, just to hear it that way. And again, that's not something that anybody's supposed to notice. You're supposed to not notice it, but like, you know, when you're creating this mix, as an engineer, your goal should be to create, to frame the song in the best possible light, and then also to make it as engaging as possible for the listener. Somebody's going to hear this, and then compared to a song where that effect isn't present, you know, hopefully the listener gravitates to this song over another song similar to it for that reason, whether they know that or not. Obviously, that's got more to do with the song itself than anything, but you can certainly, you know, emphasize certain things or add certain things at the mix level to achieve that effect. But yeah, that's all I have for our discussion of time-based effects here. Come back same time next week for week 12, and we'll be talking about a really fun topic, master bus processing, which is not to be confused with mastering. That's a different thing. We're going to be talking about processing the master bus in the mix, applying effects to the entire mix. Well, I should say processing, not effects, but after the discussion we've just had, but applying processing across the entire mix, and the considerations involved with that. So yeah, come back next week, and until then, good luck.